October 1944. The Vosges Mountains in eastern France were bleeding. It was a landscape of jagged peaks and suffocating forests, where the German defenders held the high ground like ancient kings. And every American advance was met with a lethal rain of steel. At the edge of the freezing encampment, Joseph Nich stood like a shadow carved from stone, his dark eyes scanning the tree line as twilight bled into the valley below. At 24 years old, he carried two distinct wars inside his chest. One was the modern war, the industrial slaughter of tanks and rifles and men screaming in languages he had learned in training camps. The other was an older, quieter war, passed down through generations of Apache warriors who had learned to read the earth like the white man reads a newspaper. His grandfather had taught him to track deer across rock faces where no print existed, to find water in desert wastes where settlers died of thirst, and to move through hostile territory, as if the land itself offered protection. In Arizona, those lessons were ancient history. But here, half a world away, they were the razor-thin margin between life and death. Captain Robert Fletcher approached from behind, his boots crunching on the frost-hardened ground. Joseph heard him 30 seconds before he arrived. Recognizing the specific cadence of his gait, the slight favor of the left leg from a wound taken at Normandy, Fletcher was a West Point man, trained to believe that technology, maps, and doctrine could replace instinct and experience. But 4 months in the Vosges had shattered that illusion. He had watched Joseph work, watched missions succeed that the manuals said should have failed, and watched men come home who by all rights should have been dead. Fletcher stopped beside him, his breath misting in the freezing air. The captain was only 32, but the lines around his eyes were deeper than any map could show. He had seen the whispers among the other officers, the jokes about the Indian scout that died whenever Joseph entered a room. But Fletcher didn't find them funny anymore. Not since Joseph's reading of the terrain had saved his entire company from a German ambush that would have been a massacre. Intelligence reports say there is a German observation post hidden somewhere in those mountains. Fletcher's voice was quiet, respectful. He wasn't just giving an order to a subordinate, he was consulting a specialist on a matter of life and death. They've been calling in artillery strikes with pinpoint accuracy. We lost 16 men and 2 supply convoys last week. 16 lives snuffed out by an invisible enemy. Division wants it found and eliminated before the main offensive kicks off in 72 hours. Joseph studied the darkening ridges, his eyes tracing paths that were invisible to the captain, reading the landscape the way his ancestors had read the desert winds. He saw the subtle smoke patterns that didn't match cooking fires, the particular haze from radio equipment generators, and the unnatural silence of birds in a specific valley. Apache things. The kind of details that white officers dismissed as superstition until those details kept them alive. They are northeast, 6 miles up, Joseph said, his voice carrying the faint accent of the reservation mixed with the flat tones of military English. There is a ridge overlooking the whole valley. That is where I would be. Fletcher pulled out his map. But he knew the map was useless compared to the man standing next to him and the mission's success. The plan was as suicidal as it was brilliant. A gamble made in the deep, suffocating dark, using the very geography that the Germans considered their greatest ally as a lethal weapon of surprise against them. At exactly 2200 hours, 6 shadows slipped away from the American encampment and dissolved into the primeval blackness of the Vosges forest. Joseph Nich led the way, moving with a predatory, fluid grace that seemed to ignore the tangled roots and treacherous undergrowth that tripped lesser men at every turn. Behind him followed Captain Robert Fletcher, Doc Harrison, Young, terrified Reeves, Whitlock with the heavy radio pack, and Kowalski, the man who carried the demolition charges meant to end the German dominance of the valley. Joseph chose the Gorge, a jagged, ancient scar in the mountain's granite face, where the glacial meltwater roared with a deafening, consistent white noise that swallowed everything in its path. To any conventional military mind, the Gorge was an absolute impossibility, a death trap of slick, algae-covered rocks and freezing currents that could smash a man's bones in seconds or sweep his body into the unseen abyss. But to Joseph Nich, it was a sanctuary of silence. The roar of the water provided a natural, impenetrable cloak, masking the sound of their heavy boots and the inevitable metallic clinking of their combat gear. But it also rendered them deaf to the world above. They moved in a single file, strict 5-meter spacing. Hand signals the only language allowed in the freezing spray and the blinding mist of the mountain. The terrain was a psychological nightmare. Rocks that looked solid shifted like treacherous sand under weight. Handholds crumbled into frozen dust when gripped with numb fingers. And the water was cold enough to stop a human heart in mid-beat. At one point, Harrison's boot lost its grip on a patch of black ice, and he began to tilt backward toward a 15-foot drop into the churning, violent rapids below. Joseph's hand shot out with the sudden speed of a striking viper, gripping Harrison's wrist with a strength that felt like forged iron, and pulling him back from the jagged edge with a single, smooth, effortless motion. No words were spoken, just a brief, intense nod before the march continued deeper into the void. They emerged from the gorge 3 hours later, soaked to the bone and shivering in the biting mountain wind, but they were deep inside German territory without a single shot fired or a single alarm triggered by their passage. Joseph called a halt in a cluster of massive boulders, his senses immediately expanding like a net to read the new, hostile environment. He wasn't looking for the enemy with his eyes. He was listening for the broken rhythm of the mountain. He remembered his grandfather's voice back on the Arizona reservation, telling him that the forest has a pulse, and when humans enter, that pulse skips a beat. He closed his eyes, filtering out the wind and the distant, muffled rumble of the front lines far below. He heard the absence of crickets in a specific thicket, the nervous, unnatural silence of the small mammals that should have been active, and then the faintest, most unnatural scent of all, tobacco smoke, carried on a wind that shouldn't have been there. Northwest, 400 yards, Joseph whispered, his voice barely a breath in the freezing night. There is a sentry post. 2 men. They think they are hidden behind a fallen pine, but they are breathing the wrong way, and the forest is afraid of them. Fletcher strained his eyes through the darkness, seeing nothing but shadows and cold stone. His West Point training told him the approach was clear, but his survival instinct told him to trust the man from the desert. "We can't go around," Joseph continued. "It adds 2 hours we don't have, and we would hit them in the daylight. We go through, and we do it quietly." The team settled into the rocks, checking their knives and their resolve for the violence that was coming next. They were no longer just soldiers in the United States Army. They were a war party in the most ancient tradition, guided by a scout who saw through the lies of the darkness and the arrogance of the enemy. The ridge loomed above them like a dark, jagged throne for the German artillery spotters. But the ghosts of the Apache were already at the gates, and the mountain was starting to speak their language. This was the essence of the stealth strategy, not just moving without sound, but moving with the absolute, unwavering conviction that the land itself was an American ally, while the enemy remained blind and arrogant to the predator at their heels. The final ascent was beginning. The darkness of the Vosges forest was no longer an obstacle. It was a weapon, a velvet shroud that Joseph Nich draped over his men as they positioned themselves for the ultimate act of silent violence. They reached the choke point just after 0100 hours, a narrow defile where the mountains squeezed the trail between two jagged, obsidian boulders. It was the perfect kill zone, a place where a man's confidence would lead him directly into the arms of his own executioner. The German patrol was coming. 4 men moving with the casual, reckless rhythm of soldiers who believed they owned the night. They were laughing, low, guttural murmurs in a language that sounded like iron striking iron, their rifles slung over their shoulders as if they were walking a country lane in Bavaria. Joseph watched them through the pine needles, his heart rate steady, his breath a slow, deliberate flow of ice. He wasn't a private in the 45th Division in that moment. He was the cumulative shadow of every warrior who had ever stood on a ridge in Arizona, waiting for the bluecoats to make a mistake. He raised his hand, a signal that didn't just command his men, but commanded the very silence of the forest to hold its breath. When the lead German stepped between the boulders, the world fractured. There was no explosion, no roar of machine guns, just the wet, heavy sound of reality being rewritten. Joseph hit the first man with the speed of a falling mountain, his arm locking around the throat with the surgical precision of an Apache war party, cutting off the shout, cutting off the life, before the brain could even register the presence of a ghost beside him. Captain Fletcher drove his combat knife with a brutal, clinical efficiency that defied everything they had taught him at West Point. This wasn't a tactical exercise. It was a primitive, visceral struggle, where the only rule was silence. The smell of unwashed wool, stale tobacco, and sudden, metallic blood filled the air. Doc Harrison and young Reeves took the rear pair, their movements desperate, frantic, but lethal. The struggle lasted only seconds, but for Fletcher, it felt like an eternity spent in the deepest circle of hell. The Germans thrashed, boots kicking at the mud, fingers clawing at the arms of their attackers. A frantic dance of life and death played out in the freezing dirt. And then, as if a switch had been flipped, the life left them, leaving only the heavy, cooling weight of 4 bodies. The aftermath was the hardest part. A cold, mechanical desecration that felt like a stain on the soul. Strip them. Joseph's voice was a flat, emotionless whisper. We need the silhouettes. We need the gray wool. We need the deception. They moved with a frantic, ritualistic speed, pulling the warm, blood-stained coats off the dead, swapping helmets that still held the heat of the previous owner, taking the radio codes and the belt buckles that felt like heavy, stolen coins. Fletcher looked at the man he had just killed, a boy no older than Reeves, with a picture of a girl tucked into the lining of his cap. The sickness in his stomach was a physical weight, a reminder that the price of this victory was his own humanity. But then he looked at Joseph. The scout was already different. His features hardened into a mask of pure, predatory focus. This wasn't about hate. It was about the cold, objective mathematics of survival. 16 dead in a field hospital. 43 wounded in a convoy. The numbers didn't lie. But the cost was always written in the stolen breath of young men. 5 minutes later, the transformation was complete. 4 American soldiers stood in the shadows wearing the uniforms of the enemy. Their silhouettes changed, their identities hidden in the stolen wool. They were no longer a reconnaissance team. They were a Trojan horse, moving with a tired, casual slump back toward the observation post. Joseph led them up the final ridge, his eyes fixed on the concrete bunkers above, where the German sentries were waiting for their brothers to return. They were walking into the lion's mouth, and the only thing protecting them was a thin, blood-soaked layer of the enemy's own clothing. The mountain was silent, the forest was still, and the Apache ghost was leading them toward the fire, toward the moment where the deception would either save them or become their final shroud. 0300 hours. The summit of the ridge loomed like a jagged, concrete crown against the leaden sky, a silent, predatory fortress that held the lives of an entire American division in its cold, optical grip. Joseph Nich led the way up the final, treacherous 50 yards. His stolen German greatcoat heavy with the freezing mist of the Vosges, the wool scratching against his skin like a constant reminder of the lethal deception they were wearing. Behind him, Fletcher, Harrison, and Reeves moved with a measured, weary slouch, the perfect imitation of a patrol that had spent the night fighting the mountain and just wanted the warmth of a bunker. The deception was a fragile thread, held together only by the darkness and the enemy's own arrogance. As they reached the primary entrance, a German soldier stepped out from the dim, orange lantern light of the interior, his silhouette framed by the smoke of a cooking fire. He was holding a metal thermos, the steam rising in a thin, white plume that vanished into the night. He said something about the patrol being early, a joke about them being smart enough to cut the route short, and he started to laugh. A low, guttural sound that died a sudden, violent death in his throat. He looked at Joseph, really looked at him, and for a heartbeat, time simply ceased to exist. The disconnect was total, absolute, and paralyzing. Even in the heavy shadows, even under the rim of a German helmet, the features of the Apache scout were unmistakable. The high, razor-sharp cheekbones, the dark, hawk-like eyes that carried the fire of 1,000 Arizona suns. It was a face that belonged to the desert, not the gray wool of the Wehrmacht. The German's eyes went wide with a shock that transcended war and entered the realm of pure nightmare. His brain struggling to reconcile the ghost of the mountain standing 5 feet away. Joseph Springfield came up with the predatory, instinctive speed of a striking rattlesnake, the barrel finding the German's throat before the first syllable of a scream could be formed. The shot was a thunderclap that shattered the silence of the mountain. And in that instant, the deception was replaced by a firestorm of American lead. Joseph shouted a command in the ancient, guttural language of his ancestors, a war cry that seemed to make the very mountain tremble, giving Fletcher and the others the 2 seconds they needed to pull the pins on their grenades. The explosions were muffled, heavy thuds that vibrated through the granite under their boots, followed by the frantic, metallic screams of men trapped in a stone tomb. Now, Kowalski. Fletcher roared over the sudden cacophony. The demolition specialist didn't hesitate. He moved like a machine through the smoke and the chaos, planting heavy satchel charges against the structural supports of the massive radio antenna and the concrete roof of the observation room. His hands moved with surgical, cold precision amidst the flying stone and the whistling bullets. 30 seconds, he grunted. The rest of the team formed a perimeter of lethal fire. Fletcher's Thompson barking in short, controlled bursts that kept the surviving Germans pinned inside the burning bunker. Then came the final blast, a colossal, white-hot roar that illuminated the entire Vosges range for miles, turning the observation post into a jagged pyre of twisted steel and shattered stone. The German artillery was now blind. Their eyes on the ridge had been extinguished by a scout who understood the land better than the men who built on it. The mountain finally fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. As the orange glow of the burning bunker cast long, flickering shadows across the blood-stained snow, the German artillery in the valley below was now blind, their eyes on the ridge extinguished forever by a scout who understood the secrets of the land better than the engineers who had built upon it. 6 shadows slipped back into the freezing, swirling mist, moving with the same predatory silence that had brought them to the summit. They didn't retreat. They simply faded, dissolving into the ancient, dark forest as if they had been a collective hallucination born of the cold. By the time the German reinforcements reached the smoldering ruins, the ghost of the Vosges was already gone, leaving behind nothing but twisted steel, shattered stone, and the heavy, crushing weight of an impossible defeat. Captain Robert Fletcher looked at Joseph as they crossed back into the safety of the American lines at the break of dawn, seeing not just a decorated soldier, but a living bridge between two worlds. The medals would eventually come, the formal citations for gallantry under fire. But the true victory was written in the thousands of American lives that would now survive the coming offensive because one man refused to follow the manual. Joseph Nich returned to the vast, red rock canyons of the Arizona desert after the war was won, a man who had fought 2 separate battles and emerged victorious from them both. He walked the sun-drenched trails of his home, listening to the ancient rhythm of the earth, a hero whose name would be whispered in hushed tones at West Point and around reservation fires for generations to come. He had proven that technology, rank, and military doctrine are nothing without the primal instinct of the hunter and the deep wisdom of the land. The Vosges Mountains still stand today, rugged and indifferent. But if you stand on that high ridge and listen to the winter wind, you might still hear the faint echo of a war cry that changed history. The Apache ghost had finished his hunt, and the valley was at peace. It was a victory of the spirit, and a legacy that will never fade. A story of the shadows that saved an army, a legend born in Arizona and forged in the fire of the Vosges.